Oh my God. No, no, no.
For 3 months, I sat across from my husband every single night and watched him stir something into my tea, believing with everything in him that he was slowly taking my life. What he never knew, what he could never have imagined, was that I had stopped drinking that tea 89 nights ago. Every cup he prepared with such quiet, practiced care, every spoon he stirred, just a little too slowly, just a little too deliberately, had been swapped, hidden, poured away into the sink the moment his back was turned. For 89 nights, I smiled at him across that table. For 89 nights, I let him believe his plan was working. And for 89 nights, I was building something of my own, something he would never see coming until it was far too late for him to stop it. My name is Linda. I am 52 years old, and until 3 months ago, I believed I knew the man I married better than I knew myself. Gary and I had been together for 22 years. We built a life, a home, a business, a routine so familiar it felt like breathing. And it was in the quiet comfort of that routine that he chose to hide the truth from me, night after night, cup after cup. But somewhere behind a locked drawer in our bedroom, behind a hidden camera I had installed without his knowledge, and behind a business card from a divorce lawyer tucked inside my coat pocket, I had already begun writing the ending to this story, and it was not the ending Gary was expecting. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. By the time you reach the end of this story, you will no longer be certain who the true victim really was. You will question everything you thought you understood about trust, about marriage, about the quiet danger of loving someone who is capable of hiding an entire second life behind your back while still kissing you goodnight. This is the story of a woman who chose silence over confrontation, patience over panic, and evidence over accusation. This is the story of 90 nights that changed everything, and the one night that finally brought it all crashing down. 22 years earlier, Linda had walked into a small hardware store in a quiet Ohio town looking for a set of paintbrushes, and she left with a phone number scrawled on the back of a receipt. Gary was 29 then, standing behind the counter in a flannel shirt, laughing at something she said before she had even finished saying it. She remembered thinking he had kind eyes, the kind of eyes that made a woman feel safe walking to her car alone at night. Within a year, they were married in her mother's backyard, under string lights her father had hung the night before. Within 5 years, they owned that same hardware store together, their names painted on a sign above the door. It was the kind of beginning that made people believe in second chances, in small towns, in ordinary love that quietly becomes extraordinary. For most of their marriage, Linda would have told you Gary was the steadiest man she had ever known. He remembered her coffee order without asking. He fixed the porch step before she even complained about it. He called his mother every Sunday and cried quietly at his father's funeral, in a way that told her he was capable of real feeling, not performance. Their life together was built on small, repeated acts of care, the kind that don't make headlines but make a marriage. Neighbors described them as the couple who still held hands at the grocery store after 2 decades together. Linda believed, with the kind of certainty only time can build, that she had married a good man. That certainty is exactly what made the following months so difficult to accept. The store had struggled quietly for the last 3 years, though Linda hadn't known the full extent of it until much later. A big chain hardware retailer opened 20 minutes away, and the loyal customers who once filled their aisles began driving further for lower prices. Gary took on a business partner named Richard to keep the doors open, a man Linda had met only a handful of times at holiday parties and store openings. Richard always seemed a little too polished, a little too interested in numbers Linda didn't understand. She noticed Gary grew quieter after their meetings, more withdrawn at dinner, checking his phone under the table when he thought she wasn't looking. She attributed it to stress. She had no reason yet to think otherwise. It was around that same time that Linda took out a modest life insurance policy at her financial advisor's suggestion, the kind of responsible decision middle-aged couples make without a second thought. Gary had seemed unusually invested in the process, asking detailed questions about payout timelines and medical requirements that struck her as odd only in hindsight. At the time, she saw it as him being thorough, being the same careful man who read every appliance manual cover to cover before plugging anything in. It never occurred to her that a policy meant to protect her in the event of tragedy could become, in someone else's mind, a countdown clock. She signed the papers in April. By July, everything about their nights together had begun to change. The shift was so small at first that Linda almost missed it entirely. Gary began making her tea every night before bed, something he had never done in 22 years of marriage. He called it a small gesture, a way of taking care of her, the way she had always taken care of him. She found it sweet, even flattering, the kind of late marriage tenderness people write anniversary cards about. He would stand at the counter with his back turned, stirring for what felt like a beat too long, then bring the cup to her with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. She drank it every night for the first few weeks. She slept heavier than usual. She woke up foggy, blaming stress, blaming age, blaming anything but the man who handed her that cup, with such practiced gentleness. The fog became something Linda could no longer explain away by August. She would forget conversations from the night before, misplace her keys in places she never left them, feel a heaviness behind her eyes by mid-morning that no amount of coffee could shake. Her sister Carol, who called every Wednesday like clockwork, was the first to notice something different in her voice. Carol had always been the sharper one between them, a retired nurse with 3 decades of instinct for when something in a person's body didn't add up. She asked Linda gentle questions at first, about her sleep, her appetite, whether she had seen a doctor. It was Carol who first planted the smallest seed of doubt, asking almost offhandedly, "Does Gary make you anything before bed?" Linda brushed the question off the first time Carol asked it, laughing that her sister had watched one too many crime documentaries in retirement. But the question stayed with her longer than she expected, surfacing at strange moments, while she rinsed the teacup each morning, while she watched Gary's hands move with unusual precision at the counter each night. She began paying closer attention, without fully admitting to herself why. She noticed he always prepared her cup separately from his own, always insisted on carrying it to her himself, rather than letting her pour it. She noticed the faint residue at the bottom of the cup some mornings, a chalky film she had never seen before in over 2 decades of drinking the same brand of tea. The night everything changed started like any other. Gary stood at the counter with his back to her, the kettle whistling behind him, his shoulders set in that same careful posture she had grown used to. Linda watched him from the table, the way she had every night for weeks, and for the first time, she let herself truly see what she was looking at, rather than what she wanted to believe. He stirred longer than the tea required. He glanced toward her once, quickly, almost checking whether she was watching, before turning back to the cup. When he finally set it in front of her, with that familiar half-smile, Linda felt something cold settle low in her stomach, a certainty she couldn't yet name but could no longer ignore. She didn't confront him that night. She smiled back, thanked him the way she always did, and carried the cup to the sink once he had turned toward the television. She let the tea run down the drain while the water masked the sound, her heart pounding harder than it had in years. She told herself she was being paranoid, that 22 years of marriage had earned Gary more trust than a chalky residue and a sister's offhand question deserved. But paranoia doesn't usually come paired with the specific, growing dread Linda felt standing at that sink. That night, for the first time, she didn't drink a single sip. She simply pretended she had, and went to bed more awake than she had felt in weeks. The next morning, without the fog she had grown used to, Linda noticed how sharp her own thinking felt, how clearly she remembered the previous evening's conversation, how easily she recalled where she had left her keys. The contrast frightened her more than any single symptom had. She spent the day quietly testing her own theory in small, careful ways, pouring her morning coffee herself instead of letting Gary hand it to her, paying attention to how different, how normal, she felt without whatever had been added to her nightly cup. By the end of that week, she had poured out 7 consecutive cups of tea without Gary ever noticing, and felt more like herself than she had in over a month. Linda called Carol that Friday and finally asked the question she had been avoiding out loud. Carol didn't hesitate. She told Linda to save a sample the next chance she got, somewhere safe, somewhere Gary would never think to look. That night, Linda poured half the tea into a small glass jar hidden inside an old vitamin bottle at the back of the pantry, dumping the rest down the sink as usual. She drove the sample to a private lab 2 towns over the following Monday, telling Gary she was visiting Carol for the day. She paid in cash. She used Carol's address on the intake form. She told no one else what she suspected, not even the friends who had known her for decades, because she needed to be certain before she said the words out loud to anyone but her sister. The 5 days waiting for results were the longest of Linda's adult life. She continued the nightly ritual exactly as before, smiling, thanking Gary, pouring the tea down the drain the moment his back was turned, performing normalcy so convincingly that even she sometimes forgot, for a few seconds at a time, that anything was wrong. She began sleeping with her phone under her pillow instead of on the nightstand. She started parking her car facing the street instead of the garage. Small, quiet adjustments that meant nothing to anyone watching, but meant everything to a woman preparing, without yet knowing it, for a fight she hadn't chosen, but could no longer avoid. The lab results arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, while Gary was at the store handling inventory. Carol read them over the phone first, her voice unusually careful, unusually slow. The tea contained a sedative, a prescription-strength compound typically used to manage severe anxiety, present in a dose far higher than any doctor would ever recommend for nightly use. It wasn't a poison meant to kill quickly. It was something slower, something designed to dull a mind gradually, to make a person forgetful, foggy, easy to dismiss in conversations about finances, decisions, and competence. Linda sat at her kitchen table, holding the phone long after Carol had stopped talking, staring at the same chair Gary sat in every night, trying to understand how a man capable of such tenderness could also be capable of this. It took Linda 3 days to decide what she would do with what she now knew. Confrontation felt like the obvious choice, the human choice, the one anger demanded. But confrontation would only give Gary the chance to explain, to minimize, to reframe 89 nights of quiet harm into a misunderstanding she would spend the rest of her life half believing. Instead, Linda chose patience. She chose evidence. She began writing everything down in a small notebook she kept in her car: dates, times, the exact color of the residue, the nights Gary seemed most eager for her to drink quickly. She started saving samples regularly, instead of just once, each labeled by date and hidden inside old prescription bottles at the back of a closet Gary never opened. 2 weeks into her secret documentation, Linda made a decision that would change the entire shape of what came next. She drove 40 minutes to a hardware store in a neighboring town, one where no one recognized her, and purchased a small wireless security camera meant for nurseries and porches. She installed it herself late one afternoon while Gary was at work, tucking it inside an old spice rack on the kitchen counter, with a direct line of sight to the stove, where he prepared her tea each night. She tested the footage twice to be certain it captured clear audio and video before Gary came home. That evening, for the first time, Linda watched her husband on a screen instead of across a table, and saw with her own eyes exactly what he did the moment he believed no one was watching. The footage confirmed what the lab results had only suggested. Gary retrieved a small amber bottle from inside a false-bottomed toolbox kept in the garage, one Linda had walked past 1,000 times without a second glance. He measured the liquid carefully into her cup, using a dropper, his hands steady, his expression unreadable, before rinsing the dropper and returning the bottle to its hiding place with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this dozens of times before. Linda watched the recording alone in her car in a grocery store parking lot the next morning, her hands shaking so badly she had to pause the video 3 times. Seeing it was different from suspecting it. Seeing it made it real, in a way words on a lab report never could. Linda's next move was one Carol advised against at first, worried it would move too quickly, expose too much before Linda had full legal protection. But Linda had spent enough sleepless nights performing calm to know she needed someone in her corner who understood the law better than either of them did. She found a divorce attorney 2 counties over, far enough that word wouldn't travel back through their small town's tightly connected circles, and scheduled a consultation under her maiden name. She brought the notebook, the lab results, and copies of 3 separate nights of footage saved onto a flash drive Carol had helped her back up in triplicate. The attorney's first words to her, after reviewing everything laid out on the desk, were that Linda was not simply the victim of an unhappy marriage. She was the victim of a documented, prolonged pattern of harm, one the legal system took very seriously. The attorney explained that what Gary had been doing carried real legal weight, not just grounds for divorce, but potential criminal exposure, depending on how a prosecutor chose to interpret intent and outcome. Linda left that first meeting with a folder of paperwork and a plan that felt, for the first time in weeks, like something other than fear. She was told to continue documenting exactly as she had been, to avoid confrontation until every piece was in place, and to begin quietly securing her financial independence in case Gary attempted to freeze or control shared accounts once he realized what she knew. Linda opened a separate account at a bank in another town the following week, depositing small, unremarkable amounts each time so nothing would draw attention before she was ready. While Linda built her case in silence, Gary's behavior at home began shifting in ways she hadn't anticipated. He grew more attentive, not less, bringing home small gifts, suggesting date nights they hadn't taken in years, telling her more than once how much he loved her in a tone that felt, to Linda's newly sharpened instincts, less like affection and more like reassurance he needed to hear himself. She began to wonder whether some part of him sensed a change in her, whether her improved memory and sharper reactions had registered somewhere beneath his own denial. She played along, matching his tenderness with her own, terrified that any shift in her behavior might cause him to accelerate whatever plan he was working toward before she was fully protected. It was during this period that Linda discovered the second half of the truth, the part that would eventually reshape how she understood everything Gary had done. Going through old store financial records one afternoon, while pretending to help him organize invoices, she found a series of wire transfers to an account she didn't recognize, dated back nearly a year, each one signed off by Richard, Gary's business partner. The amounts were too large and too frequent to be ordinary operating expenses. When she quietly mentioned the account number to her attorney the following week, a forensic accountant hired to review the store's books discovered something Linda hadn't expected. Richard had been siphoning money from the business for over a year, and Gary had apparently discovered it months earlier, not reported it, but instead found himself trapped by what he knew. The accountant's findings, combined with a private investigator Linda's attorney brought in discreetly, revealed a picture far more complicated than a husband simply wanting his wife gone. Richard had confronted Gary directly after Gary stumbled onto the embezzlement, not with an apology, but with a threat. If Gary reported what he'd found, Richard would ensure evidence surfaced implicating Gary as well, fabricated paperwork suggesting Gary had approved or benefited from the missing funds himself. Richard's actual demand was colder still. He wanted Gary to help him gain enough control over the business to quietly buy out Linda's ownership stake below market value, using a legal declaration of diminished mental capacity as the mechanism, built slowly, deliberately, one foggy morning at a time. Understanding this didn't excuse what Gary had done, and Linda never once let herself believe it did. But it did explain the strange, layered guilt she sometimes caught flickering across his face in unguarded moments. The way he sometimes stared at her a beat too long before looking away, as though some part of him hated himself more than she could ever hate him. Gary was not a man who had woken up one day deciding to poison his wife out of malice. He was a man who had been cornered, blackmailed, and given what someone else convinced him was the only way out, and instead of confessing, instead of trusting the marriage he claimed to still love, he chose the coward's path of slow, deniable harm, dressed up as knightly tenderness. Linda's attorney advised her that this new information changed the legal strategy considerably, though not the underlying facts of what had been done to her body without her consent. Richard, not Gary, had orchestrated the scheme from the beginning, but Gary had willingly carried it out, night after night, for 89 consecutive evenings, choosing his own protection over his wife's safety every single time he lifted that dropper. The investigators' findings were compiled into a report thick enough to guarantee Richard's exposure, regardless of what Linda ultimately decided to do about her marriage. For the first time since this began, Linda felt something shift from fear into control, understanding that she now held more power in this situation than either man realized. The night Linda decided to act, she prepared everything with the same quiet precision Gary had used against her for 3 months. She met with her attorney one final time to confirm every document was filed, every account secured, every piece of footage backed up in multiple locations no one but Carol and the attorney knew existed. She arranged for 2 local detectives, quietly informed by her attorney of the evidence against Richard, to be nearby that same evening, prepared to act the moment she gave a signal. She dressed the same way she had every night for 3 months, made herself a cup of tea herself for the first time in 89 days, and sat down across from Gary at their kitchen table. Gary noticed immediately that something was different, though he couldn't yet name what. Linda placed a manila folder on the table between them, thick with lab results, photographs, printed transcripts of the hidden camera footage, and the forensic accountant's summary of Richard's embezzlement. She told him, calmly, in a voice she had rehearsed alone in her car, more times than she could count, that she knew everything, every single night, every dropper, every excuse he had told himself to justify what he was doing, to the woman who had built an entire life beside him. Gary's face went through something Linda had never seen in 22 years of marriage, a complete collapse of the careful composure he had maintained through every dinner, every forced smile, every quiet lie. He didn't deny it, That surprised Linda more than anything else that followed. Gary put his head in his hands and told her everything. The blackmail, Richard's threats, the fabricated paperwork waiting to destroy his reputation if he refused to cooperate. The twisted logic that had convinced him harming her slowly was somehow less unforgivable than losing everything they had built together. He cried in a way Linda hadn't seen since his father's funeral, and for one brief, disorienting moment, she felt the old instinct to comfort him rise up in her chest before she caught herself, remembering the 89 mornings she had woken up foggy and frightened in her own home. Sympathy for his circumstances did not erase what his hands had done. The detectives arrived within the hour, having been given the signal through a text Linda sent from the bathroom under the guise of freshening up. Richard was arrested that same night at his home 2 towns over. The embezzlement evidence and the details of his blackmail scheme laid out clearly enough that he had little room to maneuver once questioned. Gary was taken in separately for his own statement, and though he cooperated fully, providing evidence against Richard that strengthened the case considerably, he was still facing serious charges of his own for what he had knowingly done to Linda over 3 months, regardless of who had pressured him into beginning it. In the weeks that followed, the story of what happened in that quiet Ohio home became far more complicated than a simple case of a husband trying to harm his wife. Prosecutors weighed Gary's cooperation against the undeniable fact that he had chosen, repeatedly, to place a substance in his wife's body without her knowledge or consent, regardless of the pressure he claimed drove him to it. Richard faced the heavier charges, embezzlement and blackmail chief among them, but Gary did not walk away untouched, accepting a plea deal that included both probation and a permanent record reflecting what he had done, a consequence that would follow him long after any courtroom door closed behind him. Linda filed for divorce the same week Gary accepted his plea deal, using the maiden name she had reclaimed the moment she signed the papers her attorney had prepared months earlier. She kept the hardware store, restructured under her name alone, with Carol stepping in temporarily to help manage the books, while Linda decided what future she wanted to build from what remained. She moved into a smaller home across town within 2 months, one with a kitchen entirely her own, where she began making her own tea again each night without a single trace of fear attached to the ritual. Neighbors who had once called them the couple who still held hands at the grocery store slowly learned a version of the truth, some with disbelief, others with the quiet nod of people who had sensed something off in Gary long before Linda ever said a word. Nearly a year after that final night at the kitchen table, Linda sat alone in her new home, a cup of tea steaming gently in front of her, made by her own hands from the very first pour to the very last sip. She thought often about the 89 nights she had spent smiling across a table at a man slowly trying to unravel her, and about the 90 days she had spent quietly unraveling him back with nothing but patience, documentation, and a sister who believed her before she fully believed herself. She had learned, in the hardest way possible, that the most dangerous kind of harm rarely announces itself loudly. It often arrives disguised as tenderness, poured carefully into a cup, handed across a table by someone who once swore, in front of everyone they loved, to protect you for the rest of your life. Linda still thinks about the version of herself who almost didn't ask Carol's question a second time, who almost let 3 months of fog become a permanent condition rather than a temporary threat she caught in time. She thinks about how close she came to believing her own exhaustion was simply age, simply stress, simply the ordinary wear of a long marriage, rather than something being deliberately done to her by the person she trusted most. What saved her, in the end, wasn't confrontation or anger. It was patience, quiet observation, and the willingness to trust her own instincts, even when everyone around her, including the man across the table, insisted everything was fine. Trust your instincts. Trust the fog you cannot explain. And never underestimate what a person is capable of hiding behind a smile they have practiced for 22 years. Was justice truly served in a case where one man orchestrated harm from the shadows, while another carried it out with his own hands every single night? Would you have caught the signs as early as Linda did, or would 3 months of fog have passed before the truth ever reached your kitchen table? Let us know in the comments what you would have done in Linda's place. And if this story moved you, stay close, because the next case we're bringing you is just as difficult to look away from.